welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akiriduluale. The headlines. Turkey lifts a veto over Finland and Sweden's NATO bids. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky urges action in UN address, calls for Russia to be expelled from the United Nations. And Russia warns the West that pumping up Ukraine with weapons will make Russian forces perform more missions on the ground. We'll begin with news that NATO's alliance against Russia became much stronger this morning, with Turkey agreeing to allow Sweden and Finland to join the bloc. Turkey has now lifted its veto over Finland and Sweden's bid to join the Western Alliance after the three nations agreed to protect each other's security, ending a weeks-long drama that tested Allied unity against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said the agreement addressed Turkey's concerns, including those around arms exports and the fight against terrorism. The breakthrough came after 4 hours of talks just before a NATO summit began in Madrid, Spain, averting an embarrassing impasse at the gathering of 30 leaders that aims to show resolve against Russia.
Where Finland and Sweden are invited. We had very thorough discussions, and at the end, approximately 4 hours, we could agree. We will tomorrow see all the NATO countries meeting, and we are expecting to have their statement where Finland and Sweden are invited to become members. And then we will start accession negotiations. Altogether, even though we had to compromise, I would say that we will follow also from now on Finnish legislation. We do not have any need to make changes because of this agreement. And what comes to
we don't regard China as an adversary, and China, of course, is soon the biggest economy in the world. We need to engage with China, for instance, on issues like climate change. It matters for the whole energy market. But we are disappointed by the fact that China has not been able to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that China is spreading many of the false narratives about NATO, the West, and also that China and Russia are more close now than have ever been before. But at least they stated very clearly, both China and Russia, that they were against any NATO enlargement, and that is the first time China so explicitly has in a way had a strong opinion directed against NATO and NATO enlargement.
First was Finnish President Sauli Niinistö and then Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. Well, Mr. Niinistö welcomed NATO-allied Turkey's decision, calling the deal a very necessary agreement. It means Helsinki and Stockholm can proceed with their applications now to join the nuclear-armed alliance, cementing what is said to be the biggest shift in European security in decades as the two long-neutral Nordic countries seek NATO protection. Mr. Niinistö said the concrete steps for accession to NATO will be agreed by the NATO allies during the next 2 days and would not require changes in Helsinki's legislation. Speaking along the sidelines of the NATO summit, the alliance's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, said NATO does not see China as an adversary, but is concerned about Beijing's ever closer ties with Moscow since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The comments came after China and Russia, on the opening day of the Winter Olympics on February 4th, presented a manifesto that marked the most detailed and assertive statement of Russian and Chinese resolve to work together to build a new international order based on their views of human rights and democracy. In the document, China joined Russia in calling for an end to NATO enlargement and supported its demand for security guarantees from the West. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of being a terrorist state at the United Nations Security Council meeting where members met to debate over Ukraine's crisis. President Zelensky pushed the Security Council to expel Moscow from the United Nations and to create a tribunal to investigate actions of the Russian military in Ukraine, which invaded the country on February the 24th. However, Russia is a council veto power member and can shield itself from any such actions. All 15 Security Council members, including Russia, stood for a moment of silence after Mr. Zelensky asked them to commemorate all the Ukrainians who have been killed in the war. The council met after Ukraine said a Russian missile strike deliberately targeted a shopping mall yesterday, killing at least 18 people.
Agreed by all UN members, but this, unfortunately, as of now, the United Nations does not have a legal definition of the term terrorist state agreed by all UN members. But this war that Russia is waging against Ukraine demonstrates not only the meaning of this concept, but also the urgent necessity to enshrine it legally at the level of the United Nations and punish any terrorist state. Although Russia is violating fundamental principles of the UN and the international legal order, it is still not held to account at the global level. It still remains in UN agencies and even enjoys the privileges of the seat it occupies, the seat of the permanent member of the UN Security Council, which Russia occupies solely due to the short-sightedness of politicians at the end of the Cold War. And fragments of bodies have been found ripped off limbs, hands and feet of the people. And if the Russian state claims that all these victims suffered not from its missile strike, then I suggest the United Nations sent either a special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations or a plenipotentiary commission to decide if this terrorist act at Kremenchuk, so that the UN could independently find out all the information and see that this indeed was a Russian missile strike. Almost on a daily basis, cruel Russian strikes are targeted against Kharkiv. Just yesterday, 9 were killed, 29 wounded, 5 of whom are children. I want you to know their names. It is imperative to deprive the Russian delegation of the opportunity to manipulate the UN. It is imperative to make it impossible for Russia to stay in the UN Security Council until its terrorism continues. It is imperative to establish a tribunal for investigating everything that the Russian military have done against Ukrainians, and it is imperative to give the legal definition of the notion state terrorism at the UN level. All Russian action must receive legal assessment and global sanctions for the fact that Russia is destructing international legal order. If you could commemorate all the Ukrainians who have been killed in this war, all the adults, all of our children, tens of thousands of people, and I ask you to commemorate them with a minute of silence.
The commemoration of those killed so far in the Ukrainian war there at the United Nations. Let's talk now to former Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi, who joins us virtually. Good morning, Your Excellency. Thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Is President Volodymyr Zelensky's request wishful thinking, asking for the United Nations to expel Russia?
Not really. One can think that this is so, knowing fully well that the West and most nations of the world, believing that the West and most nations of the world will not go so far. If you look at the situation that the Ukrainians today find themselves, they are not getting all the right type of arms and ammunition, weapons that they need to fight off the Russian invaders, and simply because the major powers, the rest of the major powers, do not want to disgrace Russia as it is. So I really do not see them going to the United Nations and ordering and deciding on the expulsion of Russia from the United Nations. In any case, the expulsion of Russia from the United Nations will not change the Russian attitude or what they want to achieve in the war, simply because Russia has not been confronted by the rest of the world. And Ukraine has been left to fight its own battle alone, regrettably.
Let me bring you to the NATO summit itself, which is about now on the way. And there were so many people who said, well, it was likely to be a drama of sorts. But it's proving now that maybe some of what was anticipated as a drama is not going to really happen. Turkey has gone back and reviewed its stance on the membership of Sweden and Finland, so their accession path can continue. But as you pointed out in your answer to the last question, the Western powers are trying to avoid an escalation of the war with Ukraine, and principally that means them getting directly involved. If that doesn't happen, and if they're trying to avoid that, then of what use is arming Ukraine, because Ukraine obviously is not able to fight by itself?
That's an interesting question. I mean, you are implying that the Ukrainians should just allow Russia to take over their territory. No, at least let them fight as much as they can to their honor, that they did the best they could to defend their country. But for me, the world generally, has failed them or is failing them. Look, when you look at the reasons for this whole crisis, beginning from the Russian claim that NATO has expanded, too close to its territory. Today, NATO is by far closer than it was before the start of the crisis itself. So the Ukrainians have the rights. It is a right of every country to fight to defend their territorial integrity. The point is that having come thus far, look at the massive destruction of lives and property. Look at the hits of the shopping mall or center yesterday. Shopping malls, hospitals, schools are not military targets. Look at the destruction, almost the total destruction of Ukraine. And the rest of NATO, the rest of the world is just waiting and promising, rehabilitation, Marshall Plan. How are you sure that they are the Ukraine to enjoy the Marshall Plan? Look, if these guys do not have the balls to take on Russia, let them just stop wasting everybody's time and let Russia take over the whole territory and save lives and destruction. But I can assure you that will not happen, because certainly the Ukrainians, in one way or the other, will continue to fight for their territory.
That brings me to the next challenge that NATO will have, which is the issue of maintaining the unity and resolve in even the assistance of Ukraine, because already there are discordant voices based on economic pressures and political pressures that each national leader is facing at home. Talk about the United States President Joe Biden, who is going to face midterm elections in November, and inflation is at record highs. The same thing in the UK, where Boris Johnson is also facing battles at home. The French president has been re-elected, but in the National Assembly, where laws get made and money gets appropriated, his party has lost the majority. The Germans do not want to give up gas because they say that that will have a very negative impact on their economy. You have the Hungarians who have said nobody should talk to them about cutting off Russian gas because their economy will come to a standstill. How difficult do you think all of this will be to maintain unity in the face of what you have just described that the Russians are doing in Ukraine?
Let me start in reaction to, all what you have said by saying that the Western world and the rest of us, I mean, we are also affected one way or the other. We are paying the price of indecision. We are paying the price of not recognizing that as long as this war goes on, everybody and every country is going to suffer one way or the other, except, of course, countries like China or India and one or two other places that are taking the advantage to get loose supply of, to get oil at a discounted price from the Russians. Look, I've always maintained that I know the Ukrainians do not have that huge capacity to be able to defend themselves against the Russians. But if the West has been supportive, there is no need sending a man to battle and withholding some of the things that he needs to defend himself. If you are not going to give them this hand from the very beginning and you give your own calculation and you are aware of the consequences that this will also affect you, the best thing to do from the beginning was to have done more for Ukraine so that this war will not go beyond 100 days or 200 days. But as we can see now, it's going to be a prolonged struggle. Ukrainians are going to struggle to defend as best as they can some parts of their territory. We do not know exactly the end game, where Russia wants to go, whether they just want to take over the whole of the south of Ukraine or exactly what they want to do. If the West, and I keep saying this, if the West had decided to put the greatest mistake they made in the first instance was removing the military option from the table. If they've left the military option on the table, I'm not too sure that the Russians would have attacked or would have done what they are doing today.
Given that scenario, let me ask you, let me bring it a bit closer to home, and ask you about the African response to all of this. I mean, we know what the initial African response was, and we know why at that point. But then, since then, the war has gone on, as you have pointed out, with increasing casualties, and even those who are not direct combatants have been affected, including African countries. Now, President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the African Union last Monday, that's a couple of days ago, and only 4 African heads of state.
After a long time request.
Yes, after a long time request. He was able to do it only last Monday. Now, even though it took so long in coming, only 4 out of 54 or thereabout African countries, only 4 of the heads of state tuned in to listen to what he had to say. The remaining sent smaller officials, subordinates, and so on, giving the impression that as far as they were concerned, it wasn't priority. Do you think that Africa will come back to review this later on down the line?
Look, time will tell, because already, I don't know whether you listen to, the bread producers of Nigeria or whatever they call them, who says that they are not getting enough of supply of what they need for their production, more because of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Look, anytime the world is in crisis and African leaders behave the way they are behaving, they are actually demonstrating their weakness. They are also demonstrating very clearly to everybody, as I've always maintained, that Africa remains at the periphery of global development, Africa remains at the periphery of global conversation. You know, and this, look, we are not as weak as we appear. It's just this whole question that I keep making all the time, that we appear that because we are so dependent on the rest of the world, we are so dependent either on the West, we are so dependent on Russia, we are so dependent on China. We are not, we just lack the balls to take a firm stand on any position at all. And that's exactly what played out the other day. Of course, I know some people will argue that everybody was acting on their best national interest. But as we have discovered, the world is becoming a global village. The fact that a couple of things cannot come from Ukraine is causing massive disruption all over the world. The fact that Russian oil all of them cannot get into the market is causing crisis all over the world. So we must have the courage to take a decision or to stand one way or the other. This whole idea of pretending not to exist at all, I'm not too sure that African leaders are doing the continent much service. They should be able to stand up for something, for goodness sake.
Ambassador Joe Keshi, former Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, thank you for your time this morning and thank you for your perspective.
Thank you for having me again. Thanks.
Coming up after the break, U.S. government unveils new sanctions against Russia, including a ban on new imports of Russian gold. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Firefighters and emergency workers have been clearing rubble and debris from the ruins of an eastern Ukrainian shopping center destroyed in a missile strike. Exhausted firefighters searched for survivors as authorities said 36 people were still missing after Monday's Russian missile attack that killed at least 18. However, Russia denies hitting the mall, saying it had struck a weapons depot and a subsequent explosion of ammunition had triggered a fire in the nearby complex. Speaking at the scene, Ukraine's Prosecutor General Irina Venediktova reminded people of the importance of going to shelters when air raid sirens sound. During an air raid alert on Tuesday, the country's Interior Minister Denis Monastrisky, one arm in a bandage after giving birth for those injured in the strike, sheltered in the basement of a hotel. He said the missile strike on Monday was a reminder to Ukrainians to heed air raid sirens. In the meantime, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that the more weapons Western countries send to Ukraine, the longer the conflict in the country will last. Russia has repeatedly blamed the West for prolonging the conflict, which Moscow calls a special military operation, and has targeted missile strikes against arms depots storing weapons provided to Kiev by the United States and Europe. Speaking at a news conference during a visit to Turkmenistan, Mr. Lavrov said Russia had not targeted a shopping center in the Ukrainian city of Kremenchuk on Monday. Echoing a statement issued by Russia's defense ministry earlier, Mr. Lavrov told reporters the mall was empty at the time and that the blaze had broken out there as a result of Russia hitting a nearby arms depot storing Western weapons.
Все средства массовой информации на Западе взорвались видеороликами из Кременчуга.
We have repeatedly commented on US and European plans to pump new and different weapons into Ukraine. These plans are being implemented against the backdrop of vociferous statements about how unfeasible it is to achieve peace on Russian terms, about how inadmissible it would be to start peace negotiations until Ukraine reaches a decisive turning point in its military activities. You read all this, all blaring from screens and social media. It seems to us that the kind of line that the West has taken is absolutely counterproductive and harmful. The more they pump weapons into Ukraine, the longer this conflict will last, and the longer the agony of the Nazi regime, which is supported by Western capitals, will continue.
Well, despite Russia's call, countries are still trying to help Ukraine with aid. Canada says it will provide an additional 151.7 million Canadian dollars, that's about 118 million United States dollars, to Ukraine for humanitarian development and security support. According to a statement from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office, Canada will also give Ukraine a loan of 200 million Canadian dollars through the International Monetary Fund to help meet its urgent liquidity needs. Mr. Trudeau also said that the 73 million Canadian dollars in humanitarian assistance Canada pledged on April 9th, 2022 has now been allocated to address the crisis in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Japan, on the other hand, has said that it will extend an additional $100 million in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who was in Germany to attend the G7 Leaders Summit, made this known, adding that Japan would also provide support to expand Ukraine's grain storage capacity as the harvest season nears. Mr. Kishida travels to Madrid later on, where he will become the first Japanese Prime Minister to take part in a NATO summit. Let's talk now to Kate Rebache. I hope I got that right. She's former head of Ukrainian diaspora in South Africa and joins us virtually. Good morning to you, Kate. It's good to have you on the program.
Good morning. Thank you.
Now, you're Ukrainian, so maybe my very first question will be, what's your feeling about what's going on in your homeland? Obviously, it's tragic, and you probably have people there.
Thank you for your question. Yes, the feeling is absolutely horrendous. We are under immense pressure, individually wise, community wise. It doesn't matter that you're 1,000 miles away from home. You're still feeling that sorrow, sadness, and depressive feelings, really, and really struggling to cope with the everyday events that are occurring in Ukraine. So the major point is, it doesn't matter how long, how far away you're from home, you're always feeling the pain. What is at pain is your heart. It's Ukraine. Ukraine is at pain.
Are you able to speak to friends, family members, and so on back home? And if so, what are they telling you?
Yes, absolutely. I'm in regular communication to my relatives. Some of my relatives are on the occupied territories. I cannot mention directly at this particular moment on which territories they are to not undermine their security. I'm in a constant contact with them. Sometimes the communication breaks away due to the it's a known fact that Russia is trying to dismantle the communication systems on those territories. Some of my relatives have had an incredible, wonderful opportunities experiencing a lot of aid and help, and were traveling from those territories, finally left these territories. Their experiences were really horrifying. From what I've heard and I've listened to, there were cases where somebody got murdered right in front of their house, and my family members could not pick up that person for weeks because they were afraid to leave their apartment building. Finally, there are reports of people disappearing, of rapes, different kinds of assaults, criminal really. The relatives that have left, had an opportunity to leave these territories, struggled immensely during the period of their travel. For example, one of the columns got shot, and my relatives' children were incredibly scared, frightened. The kids were screaming during the shootings. They afterwards they had a period of time where they were staying over at some guest house for a week or so on the territory that is under the control of the Ukrainian forces, and then they finally had the opportunity to leave the country. Other relatives left to other cities in Ukraine, and they reached those cities and they were shelled there. So it's a truly horrible experience. We are really worried. Every day is a war zone. It doesn't matter where you are. For us personally here, for them, I cannot even, it's unimaginable, the feelings that they're feeling now.
You are on the African continent, and as you say, regardless of where you are in the world, this is a grim picture you have painted, and the situation will reach you wherever you are. But are you disappointed in the fact that it does seem as if the continent where you currently are seems to have largely ignored what is going on in your homeland?
That's an interesting question. First of all, being Ukrainian South African and having been lived in Africa almost 2/3 of my life, I hear and I understand the sentiments that are coming from and where the place where it comes from and the justification for them on the African continent. I understand in depth the African experience. I fully sympathize with it. As a research analyst in policy and security, I may not, on the professional level, agree with some of these sentiments and feelings and opinions due to the matter that I, as a research analyst, prefer to operate with facts, with the real knowledge. But at the same time, you have to be very careful and keep in mind the African experience, you know, and understanding the sentiment that is experienced here in terms of experience of the African continent with Western countries. So I may not agree on some points factually, but I do respect I treat it with respect, the understanding of Africa, because this history, these experiences, they must be taken very carefully into consideration.
But then in that case, on the other hand, you must be quite pleased, I wouldn't say happy, you must be quite heartened with the Western response, that is the European and the United States response to what is going on, backing your homeland with money and with weapons to defend itself.
Absolutely, yes. I am pleased with this response. Despite the efforts of the Russian Federation, the NATO and G7 are stronger than ever. The recent meetings, they demonstrated this fact. Ukraine receives a lot of help. We are very grateful from our Western allies, and not only Western allies. It's very important to us, considering the history of Ukraine, considering the geopolitical situation. It's a very important step for us. And you have to always be mindful of the history. Sometimes in various countries, people maybe perhaps not fully comprehend the deep and rich history of Ukraine. And as I recently listened to the interesting interview by the great grandson of the greatest reformers Russia ever had, Pyotr Stolypin, who was prime minister in the 1911. And he directly stated in his interview to the Voice of America that it might sound harsh at the moment, but Russia has no history. What we have in our hands is deep and rich history of Ukraine, where actually most of the Russia derives from. And we have, on the other hand, mythologization of history. So what we are at this particular moment in time also doing with all of these arguments that Russia has a right, that, you know, they acted accordingly because they have special rights to Ukraine. We have a mythologization. We are living at the times of mythologization of history. And Ukraine really is the country that needs support now. We are very grateful for this. And that's how the situation at the current moment.
I cannot let you go without asking you about moves to make peace. There are those who have pointed out that under no circumstance will Ukraine ever agree to give up any part of its territory in return for peace. But then on the other hand, the Russians, as you've just identified, say that they feel they have special rights in Ukraine. What do you see? And now I'm talking to the research and development part of you, not the Ukrainian national part of you, to say, what do you see as a viable way out of this? Because ultimately, peace is what everybody wants.
Absolutely. We're living the time of the difficult times of bellicosity, you know, banditry, really, the aggressiveness, you know, but peace comes at the price. And for Ukraine, in the particular situation today, this price is heavy, this price is expensive, but the peace will only come in the event of us winning this war. I'm confident in our security services. I'm confident in our military. They're doing a fantastic job right now at the front. Our peace, unfortunately, due to the many years of making alternative choices, due to our history of learning, we learn for the past many years after the fall of the Soviet Union, we are learning a lot. And due to this, we are paying this heavy price now. And the only peace we can think of, imagine, is only if we win this war. The trading of the territories is non-negotiable. The sovereignty of Ukraine is proclaimed in the constitution of Ukraine. The territorial integrity is key. We live at the time when we cannot negotiate our territorial integrity. Here come the NATO allies. It's very important to us. It's understandable also that at this particular moment, we might not be, not today, tomorrow, this weekend, we might not be joining NATO soon, but it's going to be a laborious, strenuous process for us working on it. And eventually, I think we will prevail, we will overcome, not today, but in a matter of perhaps a year or years. And we have to win this war. To simply put it, we have to win this war. And winning comes with defending our territorial integrity and returning all the land that we had prior to even 2014.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Kate, for your time this morning and for your perspective on the program. Kate Rebache is former head of Ukrainian diaspora in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bulgaria has announced that it will expel 70 Russian diplomatic staff, and that's the largest number of Russians ordered out in one time from the Balkan nation. The move, announced by the Foreign Ministry and outgoing Prime Minister, is the largest expulsion of Russian diplomats by Sofia in recent years, and more than half the size of Moscow's diplomatic footprint in the country. The Bulgarian Foreign Ministry said those identified to be a threat to national security must leave by July the 3rd. There has been no immediate Russian response. Multiple European countries have expelled Russian diplomats following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, with Russia responding in kind by expelling European diplomats. Poland says a target set by the European Union to export 20 million tons of grain from Ukraine by the end of July is becoming unrealistic due to a lack of progress in solving logistical issues. Agricultural Minister Henryk Kowalczyk said Poland lacked the equipment to move grain over the border from Ukraine for export and was waiting for support from the European Union or other member states. Before Russia's invasion, Ukraine exported more than 90% of its grain and oilseed via its Black Sea ports on the Black Sea shores, moving up to 6 million tons per month. The European Commission said in May some 20 million tons of grain must be exported from Ukraine to make room for this year's harvest and avoid famine in Africa. Poland has said it would be possible to transport up to 1.5 million tons of grain per month through its territory, but even reaching that figure would be a challenge due to the shortage of storage, low speeds of rail freight transport, and the absence of equipment. The United States has announced a new round of sanctions against Russia, including a ban on new imports of gold, after a consensus was reached by the G7 leaders to reduce Russia's revenue at the just concluded summit in Germany. According to a statement released by the U.S. Treasury Department, the new sanctions target 70 entities, many of which are critical to Russia's defense base, including state corporation Rostec, the cornerstone of Russia's defense, aerospace, industrial, technology, and manufacturing sectors, as well as 29 individuals. The imports of Russian origin gold into the U.S. will be prohibited, according to the statement, with 3 G7 members, UK, Canada, and Japan, joining the sanctions. The import ban will apply to newly mined or refined gold released by the but exclude gold previously exported from Russia. European Union members, including Germany, France, and Italy, have not made a decision, with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying the issue must be further discussed within the bloc. Coming up after the break, Spain's King Felipe hosts NATO leaders at a dinner in his palace. Welcome back, and thanks for staying tuned. Let's take a look at some of the happenings in the world of business, especially as they relate to the war in Ukraine. Ini John McQuarrie joins me. Good morning, Ini.
Good morning.
The United Kingdom is going to cut off supplies to mainland Europe in case it is hit by shortages under an emergency plan. Is this a question of me first and then everybody afterwards.
Yeah, we've had, we've discussed crop protectionism, food. So I guess this can be called gas protectionism or energy protectionism. As we know, with the European countries winning off Russian oil, it's led to shortage. So it's me first. I mean, why should I give what I don't have? I guess that's what the UK is saying. And I think at the foundation of this also is the issue of Brexit. You know, they've been having a lot of protocols issues, Northern Netherlands, and, you know, staff shortages and all of that. So this only adds to it, or this builds on that. And everybody, or well, not everybody, a lot of countries are beginning to trigger their emergency plan. So this is UK's gas emergency plan. It's a four-step plan. And in the case of shortage, if this continues, it seems they may just, well, we're no longer in Europe anyway. You know, we're now...
So we don't have any special obligations?
Well, yeah, something like that. Even though we are fighting the war, trying to send a message to Russia, we have a common ground on that. But we also have to look out for ourselves. And I think the first victims to this might be Netherlands and Belgium, because there's an interconnecting pipe that goes directly to them, and once that is turned off, it's going to be some kind of a disaster.
Some form of really severe difficulties.
Yes. I know Germany has turned back to coal. A lot of them are turning back to coal.
And stirring up the environmentalists who thought they had won
climate
that
change,
battle.
Exactly. I thought we were making progress, but I guess the world is just, I mean, the war is just bringing a new world order. You know, it looks like that's what we're looking at this time.
Well, Iran doesn't seem to be very bothered about all of that. It wants to join BRICS.
Well, you know, BRICS is, it has Brazil, it has Russia, it has China.
India.
China is controlling 70% of that. Now, Argentina wants to join. Iran, which has the second largest gas reserve, wants to join. So I think one message, and Russia, of course, trust they're the ones pushing for this and all of that. They're supposed to have a summit and things like that. South Africa is part of them.
Of course.
You know, so it's like, well, if you guys can do your G7 and your G20 and GO, we also have our BRICS also. And if this works, they call it an alternate to the West.
Right.
You know, so if this works, it's going to be two opposing power. We'll be looking at who will win. I wonder where Nigeria will fit into all of this, you know.
I was going to ask you, but thank you for bringing it up.
I mean, I'm a Nigerian. I have to think home first. If everybody's doing food protectionism, I might as well do country protectionism.
We don't seem to be doing any of that anyway, because I've not heard of any of those things.
That makes
two of us.
You know, so this is just a way of saying, well, if the West is this powerful and if they can control things like this, because if the West can be strong enough to seize the reserve of a country and cut them off the
financial system.
Exactly. And then stop a lot of countries. And you can imagine the real damage that has gone on to Russia's economy because of the power that the West has. So I think this is just people thinking, or these countries thinking and saying, why don't we also have our own control and see if there's a way to...
and quite a number of them actually are already doing that, even on a multilateral basis outside of BRICS.
Exactly. You know, and that's why we have countries like China. I mean, US is threatening China and all of that, but they're still going on what they want to do. Now, Iran, they're standing on their own, you know, so...
Iran, incidentally, is also under sanctions. A lot of US sanctions. I mean, there seems to be maybe the formation of some kind of club.
A friend of my friend and my enemy of my enemy.
You've said that. You've said that. Now, in Sri Lanka, which is one of those places where you talk about unintended consequences, they've halted non-essential petrol sales for 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's really terrible there, and I think it's the first country they've had that. So Sri Lanka already had issues with COVID, you know, but I think with the war, it's just gotten worse. Can you imagine that you cannot drive into... I mean, in Nigeria, complaining of the long queues, but at least you can see that there's something
there's
going
something
on.
That you're going to get at the end of the queue.
I heard somebody say, I spent 5 hours. So you spend 5 hours, but you still get it. But in Sri Lanka at this time, for 2 weeks, no selling of fuel to cars.
I saw a long queue of rickshaws on one of the media outlets, very long queue of, not rickshaws, my apologies, the three-wheeled tricycles.
Tricycles.
Yes, which are quite famous in the capital of Sri Lanka. And the drivers sat and were like that.
Well, they don't even need to sit at this time anymore because they're not going to get any sales. Sales is only going to go to emergency and essentials, so medical and food supplies. Those are the people who you buy with your money, but that is what you get.
That's what you're going to get.
Schools are shut, so it's not COVID, but I mean, economic activities have been shut down, and it's really sad. We don't know how long they can
because it's 2 weeks in the first instance, but it could very well extend.
Yeah, because they said the supplies will only take them about a week if they continue selling. So that's why they're withholding. They've even gone for the cheap oil, the Russia oil and all of that, but they still cannot afford it. So they've applied to IMF and all that, but you know, there are procedures and all
I mean, all these things take a lot of time anyway, at best. Now, the U.S., that goes back to what you talked about being able to cut off. The U.S. is blacklisting Pakistani and Chinese companies for supporting Russia.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, I guess this is part of the reason why this BRICS is really coming up at this time, because a lot of corporates, and I think 25 of those 36 are in China.
Right.
You know, because of their dealings with Russia, and the term it's that they are sponsoring or they are aiding Russia to sponsor the war. So that's why they're going to the blacklist. And of course, what that means is if they get supplies from the United States and all of that, they can't get it, or those companies, the United States companies, will have to go through departments, some government agencies, and get approval before. If it's approved, then they can make supplies. So there goes BRICS again, another motivation for BRICS.
Indeed. Thank you, Ini. There'll be more on all those and other stories relating to the world of business, particularly as they come out of this conflict. Ini and Laddie Williams will be around right after this show, and then later on Business Incorporated. So watch out for that then. Thank you, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at some of the sports stories. Wimbledon is abandoning its strict all-white rule for players who want to show solidarity with Ukraine after Russia's invasion. World #1 Iga Swiatek wore a blue and yellow ribbon on her cap in a sign of unity with Ukraine. Ukrainian players Lesia Surenko and Alenina Kalina were also expected to wear ribbons when they come up against each other later on today. The tournament had a strict dress code which states that competitors must be dressed in suitable tennis attire that is almost entirely white, and this applies from the point at which the player enters the court, and white does not include off-white or cream. Meanwhile, Kalina, who we referenced earlier, said she will use her prize money from Wimbledon to help rebuild her parents' home after it was bombed during the Russian invasion. She said her parents are now staying at her apartment while the rebuild work takes place at their home in Irpin, which was retaken from Russian troops in late March. The town near the capital Kiev was heavily damaged at the start of the invasion. Wimbledon banned players from Russia and Belarus from playing at this year's tournament following the invasion. And finally, before we leave, Spain's King Felipe and Queen Letizia held a welcome dinner at the Royal Palace in Madrid as NATO leaders prepared to kick off a two-day summit today. The Madrid summit must stand for the future. It must provide conviction, the guidance and the necessary instruments for us to adapt to this new strategic reality and to walk with determination towards the future in which our societies can feel safe and live in peace. That's according to King Felipe, who was addressing the guests at the dinner table. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and leaders of Sweden, Finland and Turkey did not attend the reception dinner as the three nations had been busy hammering out an agreement where NATO ally Turkey lifted its veto over Finland and Sweden's bid to join the Western Alliance. The three nations agreed to protect each other's security, ending a weeks-long drama that tested Allied unity against the invasion of Ukraine.
The Madrid summit must stand for the future. It must provide conviction, the guidance and the necessary instruments for us to adapt to this new strategic reality and to walk with determination towards the future in which our societies can feel safe and live in peace. A new era may be dawning for NATO here in Madrid. Welcome again and enjoy the evening.
And that's how we wrap up this morning's show. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akere-Duluale. Do join us for an update of these and other stories relating to the war in Ukraine at 5 o'clock within the world today. But for now, you have yourselves a pleasant day ahead. Good morning.